America's Darling, the story of J.N. Ding Darling, is being brought to you in part by the Ding Darling Wildlife Society, Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, the Community Foundation of Greater Des Moines, Visit Florida, the City of Sanibel, Florida, the City of Des Moines, Iowa, U.S. Department of the Interior Fish and Wildlife Service, and Humanities Iowa.
I remember as kids saying, "Ding Darling, Ding Darling."
It's a name that resonated as a source of creativity and ideas.
It's kind of a musical name.
Hello, I'm Chris Steffen. We have a fantastic story to tell you about my great-great-grandfather, Ding Darling. You see, Ding was a nationally known cartoonist who changed America by influencing presidents, shaping our landscapes, and winning the hearts of so many. But first, let's take a quick look backward.
Since the beginning of time, certain people have been trying to protect the land. If you read the Bible, you'll even feel passages about the need not to spoil a land, to pass it on to your children and your children's children. The modern conservation movement begins in the 19th century, really with the Transcendentalists, with Henry David Thoreau writing Walden's Pond, Emerson's Essays on Nature, and that merged with things like the Hudson River Valley painters and with aristocratic hunters that wanted to make sure game was saved. But the modern sense of the conservation movement really takes hold after George Perkins Marsh writes a book called Man and Nature. This book had this powerful impact on what will happen to a society that has deforestation or that shoots up all this game. It's Roosevelt's ascendancy to power in 1901 that put conservation as the #1 issue. He said to protect our natural resources comes before a big navy, comes before trade. It's the #1 goal in the United States is to protect our land from ruin. And at that point on, the conservation movement caught fire. And today, many people call it ecology or environmentalism, but it's all about people that really care about their surroundings and treasured landscapes.
Ding's real name was J. Norwood Darling. Ding was his nickname. He was one of the most famous editorial cartoonists of his time, and his work was seen in newspapers across the country. He was a man with many talents and interests, as you will see, and he became one of our great pioneering conservationists. Ding's grandson is Kip Koss. Kip was really close to his grandfather. I've heard Grandpa Kip tell stories about Ding ever since I can remember, and I almost feel like I knew Ding.
Ding Darling was my grandfather. I grew up living next door to him, and I knew him until his death. I was 27 years old when he died. He was a wonderful grandfather. I learned many things from him. It was as I grew older that I began to appreciate better what an extraordinary man my grandfather was.
J. Norwood Darling was born in 1876 in Norwood, Michigan, so you can see where his middle name came from. His parents must have felt close to the people of Norwood to give that name to their son. Ding started drawing when he was a boy. His artistic ability was apparent as he drew this at only 8. Darling
grew up poor. His father was a preacher. Preachers didn't make much money.
In my young eyes, my father was a wonderfully gentle and kindly man. He too had wanted to be a doctor, but the call to the ministry had prevailed.
They were educated people. His mother also had a college degree. Now, in the late 1800s, that was unusual. So Darling grew up in that environment. Darling never had any formal instruction in drawing cartoons. He always had a sketch pad with him, and he always was drawing. As a grammar school student, given an assignment to draw a picture of a fish, he would keep at drawing that fish for the next week, no matter even if the paper was turned in. He also was helped by a photographic memory of almost anything visual. He had that ability to retain the outstanding characteristics of the subject. And in effect, they were caricatures. But they were such fine caricatures that they stood out, and you recognized immediately what he was drawing.
They ended up moving out to northwestern Iowa, which is the Sioux City. But many people don't realize that Sioux City was the Wild West. And he grew up hunting and fishing, exploring, having a Jim Bridger kind of outdoor life. And it never forgot it. He once famously said about his childhood in Iowa that if only that could have been saved, if somebody could have filmed it all and shown it to people and then show what it looked like years later, they would become conservationists. So Iowa never left him. Ding Darling ended up meeting kings and queens and befriended presidents and traveled everywhere in the world. But he was an Iowa farm boy who loved the outdoors first and foremost.
When Ding was a boy, he loved to fish and hunt and explore the outdoors. In fact, this is one of his decoys. So he got to know the landscape and the wildlife that inhabited it. He lived very close to nature, and this became a part of who he was.
Growing up as a young man, he became aware of the change in our environment that was taking place. Every summer, when Darling was a teenager, early teenager, he would go back and spend the summer on his uncle's farm, helping out with the harvest and planting the harvest and whatever. It was the being gone for a year and coming back and seeing the change in the land, and not for the best. When he saw these changes, he analyzed that these represented a problem. And in the fashion that was unique to Darling, he could not only identify a problem, he could figure a solution, and then he could even figure out how to implement the solution.
I remember it really touched me to hear his Ding Darling's account of visiting his Uncle John's farm, and that it was such a beautiful, the waters were clear, the soil was fertile, all of the birds were there, and then when he returned years later, the water was muddy and wasn't clear, and the soil had been depleted, and he started developing a philosophy of nature's laws. You must take care of the place in which you live if you want it to continue to sustain your life.
It's interesting that Darling, as he became a well-known conservationist, people would talk to him about his love for wildlife. And there's no question that he did have a love for wildlife, particularly birds and ducks and waterfowl. But he pointed out, he said, although I love these animals, he said, that's not the important thing. The important thing is that they are the delicate indicators of the future. And when you see populations of birds or creatures being crowded out, dying. The humankind is not far behind.
Ding went to college with the plan of going into medicine. He enrolled at Beloit College in Wisconsin, where he fit right in. He was head of the Glee Club, manager of the track team, managing editor of the college paper, and made a decent income as a singer, mandolin, and accordion player. This is his accordion. In short, he did everything except study. But Ding had a great time, until his artistic talent landed him in some trouble.
He had already started to sketch when he went to college. And he drew sketches of the faculty, which were not always too complimentary to the faculty. And they reached the end of their tolerance when he drew all the members of the faculty, including the president of the university, in tutus and little ballerina outfits in a chorus line. And they said, that's enough of that, Darling, and out you go. Darling in later years said, well, he said, the fact of the matter is I was a lousy student. So you take your choice on that.
I guess cartoonists are a little bit of troublemakers. I guess that's one of our biggest downfalls. I'd always found out that drawing teachers was the worst thing you could possibly do. And I think he found out the same thing when he was at Beloit College. But yet cartoonists, for the most part, have been rabble-rousers. And that's what we're really supposed to be doing.
It had not been easy for my family to send me to college, and the shock of that fall from grace had been sudden and painful. I didn't even bounce. The view from where I landed after that catastrophe was not propitious, and running away with the itinerant opera company had not helped any. That summer I had learned to know just how a dog feels when he returns home with his tail between his legs.
After spending a year traveling around the country, doing odd jobs, being a farmhand, musician, and a reporter, Ding went back to college and graduated in 1900. Then, he returned to his hometown, Sioux City, and landed a job as a cub reporter for the Sioux City Journal, thinking he would save money for medical school. But a different career was in store for him.
He got a job as a reporter for the local newspaper. One of his first assignments was to go cover a trial of a famous citizen, or well-known citizen in Sioux City. Being a good young reporter, he took his camera along to not only record a picture and to accompany the article. When the well-known person saw the camera come up, he just went berserk. And he chased after Darling with waving his cane and threatening Darling, and Darling didn't get his picture. He goes back and he draws a picture of this fellow, menacing with the cane. And it was quite a hit in the newspaper, but not a hit with the gentleman whose picture was drawn. And Darling got his start as an illustrator in the Sioux City Journal, which quickly went into a series of being editorial cartoons. He would recognize very quickly what the talent he was. He was drawing not only irate local citizens, but he was drawing politicians, presidents, subjects of discussion in the current day.
And from that time on, I was completely immersed in the exciting environment of newspaper illustrations and cartoons. So it was that I became a cartoonist by accident of circumstances and not by design.
After working at the Sioux City Journal for a few years, Ding took a new job at the Des Moines Register. His cartoons were front, top, and center every day, like here in this 1940s Des Moines Register. And not just in that paper. His cartoons were syndicated and appeared in more than 100 newspapers across the country. He started drawing in the early 1900s, way before radio and television, to the late 1940s. So newspapers were really the major source of news and information for people, and they loved Ding's cartoons. He even won the Pulitzer Prize, twice, once in 1924 and again in 1943.
The main paper in Iowa was the Des Moines Register, and the owner and editor asked Darling, gave him a job offer. So he packed up his wife, and off they went to Des Moines, where he started a very fine career.
The publisher at the time, Gardner Coles, told him that he had complete freedom, complete editorial freedom. The newspaper was fairly liberal at the time, and it still is. And he was told that he could do and draw whatever he wanted to. Now, most cartoonists, if not almost all of them, don't have that freedom. I think that was kind of an agreement that they'd made because politically, Ding Darling was very much a conservative Republican cartoonist, or his philosophy was very conservative, especially in fiscal areas.
Darling had a good sense of humor. In fact, in later years, he would attribute his success in editorial cartooning with the ability to express difficult ideas and difficult lessons, to coat them with a little bit of humor. And he felt you could get a message through to people as long as you put a little sugar coating around the hard part of it.
His cartoons were full of motion. When you looked at a Ding Darling cartoon, it was almost like looking at a flat animated cartoon. There was so much movement in it, and your eye continually bounced from one image to another word, to another sign. It constantly moved on you. He filled an entire piece, edge to edge, with thoughts and with exactly what he wanted to say in them.
Ding Darling became a beloved figure, almost like Will Rogers. Just people loved Ding Darling's humor and loved reading his very biting political cartoons. In the pre-television era, the cartoonist had a lot of power in politics because people would read them in newspapers, and that's what people would talk about. In fact, most Americans would go right to the cartoon, which seemed to sum up the political situation. I would say Darling was our nation's best cartoonist, and he also happened to have a conservationist fervor in it.
The issues he was concerned about: endangered species, human destruction of wildlife, protecting marshes, prairies, wetlands, all these areas that are very vulnerable in the Midwest. His images really convey the conservation message, and it's timeless.
I think his entire total, when he was done, was well over 16,000 cartoons. And if you think about that, that's a lot of cartoons, and it's one a day, and the amount of work that takes to come up with those ideas and to be able to deliver them the way that he did was a phenomenal accomplishment.
Darling drew really for half a century. He covered about everything you can think of. At least 7 presidents, 2 world wars, drew through the time when women got the vote, drew through the early civil rights problems. And what's amazing is, to this day, those cartoons that he drew almost, in some cases, a century ago, they're just as true and important and the same problems we deal with today.
Ding was such a successful cartoonist. He was always getting offers to work for other newspapers around the country, but he loved his job and he loved Iowa, and decided to stay in Des Moines permanently. He moved into a gorgeous house with his wife Penny and their 2 children, John and Mary.
place in Des Moines is a house that overlooks the Raccoon River, and it is it's a very unique house. It reflects the English and German heritage of my grandparents who built it in the early 1900s. It's kind of Tudor looking, absolutely charming, and the people who lived there after my grandparents included the Darlings, and the family that lives there now has been there for over 50 years, and I think they treasure it for all of its pluses, including the fact that Ding Darling lived there and added a very wonderful room, a 2-story library to one side of the house.
The house had been for sale for about 4 years, and my husband made an offer to buy it, and to buy it with the contents in it. It was a big house to furnish. So I think that's how we ended up with so many things that belonged to the Darlings. Ding Darling used to come over here, and that's how I got to know him fairly well. I think he was appreciative of the family was going to be living in his house. I think when you talk about the house, I think the house is very personal. And he did the 2 light fixtures, designed those and had them made. He obviously was a very creative man. There are a lot of secret places in the house that he, I think, enjoyed having my sons discover. He didn't point out where any of them were. And of course, he did his drawing in Monk's Corner.
I grew up in Ding Darling's house, and has always been a name that has echoed throughout my life as somebody who really I was surrounded by. It's a name that resonated in my mind as a source of creativity and ideas. I think part of what I learned from growing up in this house is possibility. That you can draw, you can paint, you can work with wood, you can do political cartoons, political humor, all of which is a world of great possibility. And imagination everywhere. I mean, this house has secret passages, which of course as a child it's like opening into a realm of fantasy and magic, so that half of what you imagine is already there. People would look at me and look at this house and ask, isn't it peculiar to grow up in a home that's in part a museum? And I think about the legacy of my father and mother and what that means. The lesson that I learned from that is that the books are important. The ideas contained in those books are valuable. The ability to look at art and to create art is valuable. And I think my father was very strident. He used to say, you've got to move. And it was kind of a word that took you a while to understand as a child. And now at this age, I understand what he meant. And that is that it's not enough. Excuse me. Excuse me. That it's not enough to enjoy life, but you have a responsibility to create something bigger than yourself. I think that's his legacy, my family's legacy, and Ding Darling's legacy.
In 1932, Ding was invited by none other than dictator Joseph Stalin to tour Russia, then known as the Soviet Union. So he took the Soviet leader up on his invitation and made the trip. This is the map he used while he was there. When he came home, he wrote a book about everything he had seen called Ding Goes to Russia. Even back then, being the visionary that he was, Ding didn't think communism would last. He wrote this in the preface. If something direful was going to happen to us, I was curious to know the process. Speaking for myself, I can now go back to rest in peaceful assurance of safety so far as that quarter is concerned. Whatever destruction awaits us will come from neglect of our own internal mechanisms. Our oil furnace may blow up or our gas heater smother us in noxious gases, but it will be due to our own negligence and not to Russia.
Darling was a hands-on sort of guy. And when the communism became such a sort of, a lot of debate about communism. And there were some socialists in the universities that were saying, well, that's a pretty good system they got over there, since the Russian Revolution. Darling said, he said, I'll go see for myself. So he launches off by himself, takes a ship over to Europe, makes his way to Russia to see for himself what this great revolution was. And he was invited by Stalin to go out to Stalin's country place to have lunch. And other than an interpreter, there was just Darling and Stalin. And last but not least, the housekeeper / cook, whatever.
She barked a couple of words at Stalin from halfway across the lawn. After a brief exchange, Stalin turned to us and said, quote, "We have lunch now."
According to Darling, the gal who was the chef ran the whole operation. Told Stalin when they were going to eat and where to sit, and that was it, and get with it. Darling was just terribly amused. This guy that was ruler of a good portion of the world and had a reputation of being brutal. The housekeeper's bossing him around, and she looked like she could have handled him all right, too.
My great-great-grandfather's cartoons were wildly popular. People listened to what Ding had to say. As he developed as a cartoonist, he began to draw cartoons about the environmental problems he saw around him, and he realized he could make a difference. He also began to get involved in politics and policy making, and was appointed head of the Iowa State Fish and Game Commission. This is one of his most famous conservation cartoons. It reads, "We're funny that way. We commercialize all our highways, poison our rivers with refuse, drain our lakes and extinguish our game, and then travel 1,500 miles to get back to nature."
Darling had a biological impulse. He looked at the way air and land and sea and vegetation worked in unity and recognized that really any construction or public works projects had to bring environment into the forefront. Darling never believed in the power of the mechanized world. He believed in the end, a hurricane can just wipe off a place. Erosion can destroy an island. Red tide of pollution can kill fish stock. So he is somebody who believes in the greatness of America in a kind of Republican way, Ding Darling, but also recognizes that the protection and caretaking, stewardship of the land and seas and rivers, lakes, was going to be essential if America was going to stay a great power. You couldn't gouge all resources for one generation and leave a depleted, apocalyptic landscape for the next generation.
Events have arisen which suggest caution. You remember about 5 years ago that we had what was called an infestation of what was called at the time a red tide. It isn't red and it isn't a tide, but the results are terrific. And right now, thousands of fish of all species and dimensions are washing up on our beach in front of the cottage.
Now, when you start reading his correspondence, you realize what a fine writer he was and how he could get a meeting with anybody. There wasn't a U.S. senator, no matter whether you're Democrat or Republican, that wouldn't want to have a lunch with the most famous cartoonist. I mean, Ding Darling was a marquee name, and when he started addressing issues of protecting waterfowl or wildlife habitat, a lot of Americans said, yeah, I'm standing where Ding Darling's standing.
Darling had a very practical side to it. What he was interested in is that we use our resources wisely. He just hated to see them squandered. Darling traveled all over the Midwest to spread the gospel of conservation. It was with that background that Darling was invited back to Washington to become chief of the U.S. Biological Survey, which was the forerunner of the Fish and Wildlife Service. This was under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Darling was pretty much a rock-ribbed Republican, and of course Roosevelt was a Democrat. Darling sort of dismissed the motivation for asking him back to Washington. He said they probably got tired of reading my cartoons and were trying to take me out of action. I think they thought that'd be handy to get me out of business for a couple of years.
When he came to the Biological Survey in 1934, he was primed to go. He had a vision. He was going to be there a short time, see it enabled. He didn't care who he stepped on to do it. He was passionate about it. And so after 20 months, he was largely successful. And he actually transformed the whole agency. He professionalized the agency, he reinvented the agency, and he gave them a new esprit de corps and morale that really carried him through the next 70 years.
I look back at those 2 years with more satisfaction than anything I have done in my life. It was to apply the practical principles of conservation to the wasted lands and water resources of the country that I took time out from my daily routine of cartooning. It has always seemed to me that I accomplished more visible good in that 2 years than all the cartoons I made over the 50 years of my active newspaper work.
There are 556 national wildlife refuges across America, and they make up more than 150 million precious acres. This is land that is preserved in its natural state so people like you and me can go and enjoy nature. While it was Theodore Roosevelt who started the first refuge in 1903, Pelican Island, Ding had a lot to do with making the system what it is today.
I'd like to say Ding Darling actually created the refuge system. Theodore Roosevelt created the first refuge, but between Roosevelt and Darling, refuges came in and out of the system, and they kind of functioned primarily as individual units. Darling had a systematic vision. Let's put refuges along migratory bird flyways, let's connect them up, let's have an overall national vision of what we want to do for wildlife conservation. So before 1934, you have islands of wildlife protection. After Ding Darling, you really have a refuge system where the whole is greater than the individual parts. When Darling took over, we had about 70 refuges in the entire system, and we'd started with 55 under Roosevelt, so we'd grown slowly and erratically. By the time Darling left, he'd added another 40 or 50 refuges, and his chief of refuges ended up creating 271 refuges by the time he retired. Today, there's 100 million acres to protect wildlife, another 50 million marine acres to protect wildlife. It's the largest wildlife protection system in the world, and in many ways, Darling put it on the direction that it achieved today.
Have you ever heard about the duck stamp program? Seen a duck stamp? This is what the first duck stamp looked like in 1934. Ding designed it. Actually, he got the whole program started while he was in Washington. It's a great way to raise money to preserve wildlife habitat and promote art at the same time. But I'll let Grandpa Kip tell you the story.
The idea of requiring a duck stamp, as it was called, on every hunting license, if somebody was going to hunt waterfowl, was not Darling's idea. And its purpose was to raise revenue for pursuing conservation goals. The idea had been kicking around Washington for many, many years, but nobody had ever been able to get anything done. Darling, who had this extraordinary skill for moving people, agendas, action, tackled that. And lo and behold, by some skillful political work, he got the Duck Stamp Act passed. I think that was 1934. And that program by itself has preserved over 5 million acres of critical habitat. And sort of an amusing story, after the Act was passed, lo and behold, one day in Darling's office, a couple of guys show up from the Bureau of Engraving. They said, "What, Mr. Darling, is a duck stamp supposed to look like?" Well, here we had this guy that had been drawing ducks all his life. And he said, "Well, let me see." And he looked around for, he didn't do a lot of drawing at the office. So he looked around, and there were some shirts back from the laundry, and they put a piece of white cardboard in the shirt to keep it stiff in those days. And so he goes over the shirts and he pulls out a couple of pieces of cardboard and he brings them back to his desk and he goes like this and draws this picture or two. And he said, well, you know, something like this. And then he looked at his watch and he'd gotten distracted with the drawing and talking about it, and he was way late for an appointment. He said, I've got to run. So he whips out of the office, leaving these two guys behind. And he gets back after lunch. The two guys are gone, and so is the white cardboard. They took that back to the Bureau of Engraving and used Darling's image to create the stamp. Sort of interesting.
Well, I first became aware of the duck stamp through my father, who collected them starting in 1934. And he bought his first duck stamp, and he thought it was such a cool thing that he saved his and every member of his families. So I was aware of the program, and then when I found out that there was a contest to pick the art, you know, being artistic myself, I thought, well, that'd be a dream come true to win that one day. And through the art and getting involved in the duck stamp, I really learned what an amazing conservation project it is. I work closely with my brothers, Bob and Joe. We all paint the same type of subject matter. They've won the duck stamp contest. And it really helps us, I think, to have someone to bounce your ideas off of. All the acres of wetlands that they've bought, that's where we grew up hunting on a waterfowl production area bought with duck stamp dollars. It's great to be a part of a program that contributes so much back to nature.
The connection, and it's a beautiful connection between the duck stamp and Ducks Unlimited, is that over the years, we have, at Ducks Unlimited, fostered, advocated, and been among the greatest champions of the duck stamp in this country. Started in 1934 by this wonderful man, Ding Darling, as a volunteer effort. And so that started the idea that it's our responsibility to pay for this. You can't simply turn to government to make everything happen. All of us as citizens have to do our part. Now, government needs to do its part too, but we as citizens and non-government organizations need to do our part. And so Ducks Unlimited has walked in lockstep with the duck stamp program throughout the years, helping to sponsor the duck stamp contests.
And our 2012 duck stamp winner, Joseph Hopman.
Ding thought education was an important part of saving the environment, that scientists were necessary to get accurate information to policymakers. He really took things into his own hands to get an environmental science training program started in Iowa and then across the country. Today, the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation awards the Ding Darling Scholarship to students in the original program Darling started at Iowa State.
Ding Darling's passion, his compassion, and his absolute dedication to not giving up, to make things better, just instilled that excitement and energy in people around him. He was the leader that created what we now know today as the Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Units, and they are housed in universities across this country, and they are partnerships between the university, the State Fish and Wildlife Agency, and the federal government. A true cooperative partnership. He started that. He brought science into the decision-making in a big way.
He came to Iowa State University president in 1932 and said, I will put up $3,000 a year for the next 3 years if you will match it, and I will get matching funds from the Iowa Conservation Commission. And so that deal was struck. Darling convinced Congress to have a program similar to the one at Iowa State as a national program. And so they agreed to form 9 new units in 9 different land-grant schools and in 9 states. Today there are 43 units in 40 states. And those units have turned out literally hundreds of scientifically trained wildlife and fisheries biologists who have assumed their roles in various state organizations and national organizations. both public and private. He had a way of twisting people's arms, and he was a mover and a shaker. He just was a person who wouldn't say no, I guess, and just kept moving people to do things that he felt were important. And that's one of the great things about him. You know, there's a story I think I've heard that David Lynch talked about in his book, that the bill that established the unit program, they weren't sure that Franklin Roosevelt would sign it, so they waited until he was on the verge of going on a fishing trip. And they took him the bill, and he quickly signed it without reading it. So there are all kinds of techniques that one can do in order to get what you want. And I think that Darling was especially good at that.
The Ding Darling Scholarship is awarded by the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation to students who have demonstrated scholarly achievement and the ability to communicate a conservation ethic. In my case, I had published several papers and had written some non-technical pieces as well about conservation, mostly related to waterfowl and wildlife. The Ding Darling Scholarship has definitely made it possible for me to continue my studies, not just monetarily, but also through helping support my research as well. It's definitely been hard to go to school and raise a family and continue performing research, and the Ding Darling Scholarship has definitely made that possible.
Ding's involvement with clubs and groups didn't end with college. He belonged to the Isaac Walton League, one of the country's original conservation organizations, helped start the Men's Garden Clubs of America, and later, after he had worked in Washington, started what is now the National Wildlife Federation. The National Wildlife Federation has grown into a large national organization that really reaches out to kids as part of its mission.
He knew that his time in government was short and that he really needed to have an organization to give voice to wildlife. And so he convinced the President of the United States, FDR, to call the first National Wildlife Conference. And it was in that conference that he formed the National Wildlife Federation. Darling sent out invites to sportsmen and other conservation leaders across America to bring them together to this conference. In launching the National Wildlife Federation, had told the assembled delegates that 1,000 stallions unconnected could not move a baby carriage. And it was his way of describing the fact that all these conservationists, well-intended as they were, if they weren't willing to connect to one another, weren't willing to be a part of something bigger, that they weren't going to be able to even move a baby carriage. And so it was a very poignant description of the moment that he was seeing in front of him. And that was true. People cared, but they weren't connecting their cares to others who also cared. These people came together really out of their passion for nature to identify those groups that were already in existence and bring them into the fold, and to form a nationwide network of conservation leaders who could work together to pass important legislation. Darling understood that if you could get federal funding locked in and then require that the states lock in their money too, that you could get a long-term funding source for fish and wildlife. And it's without a doubt the most significant wildlife funding source that we have even to this very day. The National Wildlife Federation honors the memory of Ding Darling each year with the Ding Darling Award. It's for people who have demonstrated outstanding achievement in the field of conservation and environmental protection, and particularly those who have a love for nature and who express that through their works. In 2011, National Wildlife Federation honored Robert Redford for his lifelong achievement in the field of conservation. You know, Redford has demonstrated throughout his career that he cares about nature, and he's never been timid about expressing that passion that he has for nature.
Ding first met Herbert Hoover during World War I, and they stayed friends for life. The Darling family were even overnight guests at the White House. This is a thank you cartoon they sent to the president. Grandpa Kip tells a humorous story about when he was 16, he took the car to pick up Mr. Hoover at the railway station. Kip sat quietly while Ding and Mr. Hoover talked about major current events at the dinner table. He got quite a surprise when Ding turned to him and said, "Well, what do you think?" Ding wasn't just being funny. He really did care about what younger people thought.
Bear in mind that a youngster takes for granted his surroundings. I took it more or less for granted when I was 16 years old, and he asked me to go down and pick up President Hoover at the railroad station and bring him over to the house for dinner. That was grandfather, and you take it for granted. So
The relationship between Ding Darling and Herbert Hoover is complicated. Ding Darling was a Republican, but he was a TR Republican, which is different from a Herbert Hoover conservative. And so they had a mixed relationship. I think on the integrity level, he admired Herbert Hoover, but was always disappointed that Hoover didn't get conservation enough.
There are not too many years left for me to commend you, your monumental service to our country, and your generous recognition of me and my little family as humble worshipers at your shrine.
A lot of people didn't know it, but Ding was more than a cartoonist. In fact, he was an accomplished artist with a special interest in waterfowl. He made drawings in pencil, ink, pastels, and charcoal, painted in watercolor. He even made sculptures. He owned a house on some land in Des Moines he called the Peony Farm. Today, it's Peony Park. There, he kept a workshop where he made beautiful etchings and trained other artists, some of whom have become very well known. Here are some of his brushes and pencils, and even one of his sketchbooks.
Darling earned his livelihood as an editorial cartoonist. Inside, he had a real interest in art. He studied other artists. One of the things that Darling was given credit for was figuring out how to portray birds in flight. He did this by always having more than one bird in his pictures, and the wings would be in different positions. It gave the impression of motion in the drawing, and artists at the time started to emulate that, and it's still done that way today.
I was 18 years old, and a friend of Ding Darling's knew me and said, "I want you to go see Ding." She sent me to his office at Des Moines Register and Tribune building, and I went up with some paintings, and I was quite timid and scared, and when I met him it was even worse because he had a gruff exterior and a gruff voice, and so I showed him my paintings, and he said, "Well, I can tell you they're nice and that won't help you a bit, or I can tell you what's wrong with them. What do you want?" I said, "I want to learn." So he said, "Let's get to work." And work we did. I had great respect for him, and of course his interest was in the same fields as mine, with wildlife and particularly waterfowl. He gave me confidence to continue my work, and it wasn't always easy. And he told me once, he said, "If you would concentrate in making 5 sketches a day of anything, a chair, doesn't matter what it is, just make 5 sketches a day for 5 years, He said, by the end of 5 years, you will be an accomplished artist. So what he was telling me, it was practice, practice, practice. And years later, he said, I can't help you anymore, Maynard, because you're beyond what I can do to help. But don't stop coming to see me, he said. I want to know your progress all the time.
Ding had been to Florida for the first time during the year he was suspended from college. In about 1935, he decided to start spending the winter there. Just off the Gulf Coast of Florida, there are two little islands next to each other called Sanibel and Captiva. Ding and his family stayed on Captiva in a small cottage at an inn named Tween Waters. As he got to know the islands, he became interested in the environment there. This is a sign from Sanibel Island. In fact, there is an interesting story behind it.
Darling had actually sort of discovered Captiva along with many of the Midwesterners, and I think he was attracted to this nice, warm climate, but in an area that wasn't as busy as, say, the east coast of Florida. It was a different person who was attracted to this calmer coast. He came here because of his bronchitis, and it was a way for him to take a little break during the winter time, but it never stopped him from being contemporary. Newspapers thrown out of the airplane window so that he could keep up on things, and he drew the entire time that he was here. But I think he had a little more time to sit back and be with his family, and I think that was important to him too. Darling had learned all his life, wherever he was, lessons about conservation. As he got older, he saw things that changed. When he came to Sanibel and Captiva, he saw some remarkable resources. So the bird life, the plant life, and he knew that things would vanish if there wasn't some sort of forward thinking here.
He was always interested in the environment wherever he was. It was only a few years before that they wiped out the egrets there to get feathers for the women's hats and that sort of thing. Darling decided the safe thing was to not have any hunting or shooting on Sanibel and Captiva Islands. So he went to the governor and got a proclamation to establish that there would be no hunting or shooting on Sanibel and Captiva Islands. Well, you know, a proclamation is one thing, but getting the proclamation to work is another thing. Darling designed a sign, a shield, with a pelican flying low over the water, and the word state sanctuary, no shooting on Sanibel and Captiva Islands. Well, he designed that. Then he cut out the shields. He drew the image of the pelican. This is all hand work. And he goes out and he nails up these signs himself. Now that's what you do when you really care about something.
I've heard Grandpa Kip tell stories about the fun gatherings at Ding's Fish House. It's kind of an unusual way to build a house, on stilts, out over the water. He got the idea from the fishermen's shacks that used to be common in the area. When the house was finished in 1942, Ding planned to move there full time, but his wife, Penny, was not impressed with the idea of the housekeeping and chores that it would present, as well as being cut off from land by a drawbridge. So the entire family didn't stay there all the time. But Ding did spend a lot of time there drawing. It was a wonderful place to get together, relax, and take in the spectacular view from the deck. I am holding a carving of a seahorse that Ding did. This seahorse is the very design that Ding incorporated into the fish house fireplace. In more recent years, the house was bought by another famous artist, Robert Rauschenberg, so it has always been associated with art and artists.
Darling was kind and gentle, and people made the comment that he made them feel good. He made them feel good about themselves, and then he was singing and he was, laughing. And I think that was being conscious of other people's spirits around him, that he was able to read people really well and read different types of people really well.
Darling's reputation was helped by the fact that he had an ally in one of the finest painters of the 20th century, in Robert Rauschenberg, who ended up taking over the Fish House, a property of Ding Darling in Captiva, and maintenancing it, and would frequent the little bistros on the Florida island that Ding Darling loved. And while they're, as artists, they're completely different. Rauschenberg being somebody who would include so much in his art, and one of our great modern painters. He found a lot to laugh at and enjoy in the cartoons of Ding Darling. So you have Rauschenberg promoting Ding Darling as a great American.
I think that both Robert Rauschenberg and Ding Darling really had an affinity for Captiva because of its natural beauty, but also because of its remove. I think that it was a respite for them both in terms of their life in different urban environments and professionally, to come and really focus on creation and to explore and be inspired. Well, the Fish House is a remarkable spot. It's just a beautiful building, and the way it's positioned on the bay, it's amazing. It's such a small structure, but it has this temple-like air about it. And walking up to it along the dock and entering it, it has a reverence to it that's really, I don't know, I think it lends itself towards meditation, towards quiet conversation, towards reflection, in a way that's atypical of most modern structures. I think the fact that so much has been created here through the decades, there's just this patina of energy, creativity that is inspirational. I think that the natural environment is inspiring unto itself.
There is a national wildlife refuge on Sanibel Island named after my great-great-grandfather. You see, although he didn't like to take credit for it, it really was his idea. He found out the state of Florida was getting ready to sell a large piece of land on Sanibel Island to developers for 25 cents an acre, so he came up with a plan. Today, the Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge is made up of over 6,300 acres. More than 700,000 people from around the world visit each year to learn about Ding's legacy and experience this pristine wildlife habitat.
They came right up to us and then turned in a beautiful flaring turn, not 100 feet away from us. That's more roseate spoonbills than we've ever seen all at one time on Sanibel.
Darling was horrified with the idea of Sanibel and this area that was so critical for migrating birds to be turned into concrete and aluminum and glass. So he put together a little outfit he called the Captiva Sanibel Conservation Group, and they put in a bid for 50 cents or 75 cents or $1 an acre to compete with the realtors. That was a delaying action, really, because simultaneously Darling went ahead, contacted his old friends in the Fish and Wildlife Service, many of whom he had mentored, contacted the governor of the state of Florida, and Governor Holland really responded quite positively to Darling's message. They took the land off the market. After achieving a delay in the sale, albeit in a temporary delay, Darling swung into action, and he advocated this land for a national wildlife refuge. The land was actually purchased by the federal government, and it became a national wildlife refuge called the Sanibel National Wildlife Refuge. Years later, following Darling's death, the refuge was renamed after Darling. So it's now the J.N. Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge.
The first time I heard about Ding Darling was when I was a child, maybe in the first or second grade, and my parents had brought us to Sanibel Island to vacation, and we went to the Ding Darling Preserve. And it was kind of, for a child, the name Ding Darling kind of was something that bounced off your lips. And I remember as kids saying, Ding Darling, Ding Darling. It's kind of a musical name. I would learn more about him in the years to come.
I think Ding Darling knew how important and precious Sanibel and Captiva Islands were. People get that connection when they come to the islands. When you drive onto the island, it's kind of like, I'm home. The first time a child looks through a pair of binoculars and they see it, they get it, they are able to identify that bird. We call that a spark bird. Hopefully that sparks the knowledge to continue to bird and see other wildlife. Visitors, after leaving the Ding Darling Refuge, I hope that they all get a piece of Ding Darling and get a piece of why this place is so special. We try to do that every day with our staff and our volunteers and the Friends group, and everybody's always connecting with them. Ding Darling Days. It's an annual event held in October in his name. It's a great time for everyone. We have something for everyone. There's always something different to see. Every day is unique. All of this in Ding's honor.
Not only is the duck stamp contest going strong, there's a junior duck stamp contest as well. It was started in the early 1990s in a Sanibel, Florida school by teacher Jay Boswell, and now it's gone national. It's a great chance for kids to develop their art skills and learn about nature at the same time. This is a painting by Jefferson Jones from Florida. With stiff competition, he's won the Florida Duck Stamp Contest 3 consecutive times now. In 2012, there were over 1,600 entries.
Ding Darling understood that children were a part of the overall equation for nature, but he also understood from his own life experience that you need to start in nature. You need to have that natural connection that kids forge when they are spending time either fishing, hunting, or hiking, or just being out of doors. And as we lose those important connections, we have less understanding and less appreciation of what our duty is as stewards.
It used to be that everybody could read The Hand of Nature, that was the last thing you would teach in school. Now, when nobody can read The Hand of Nature, we've got to make sure that it's being taught, not just on Earth Day, but on a regular, in the schools. And that's where you create the new generation of future environmentalists. That's why the great program isn't that Ding Darling did a duck stamp. It's kids today emulating Ding Darling, trying to do their own duck stamp. That's what's exciting, of bringing in the new generation and let them know that they too can be a hero of conservation in their life.
I think the young people can follow in Darling's footsteps and really become heroes of the environment just by doing very basic things, by noticing nature, by getting involved in projects like the Junior Duck Stamp program. And I think that just by doing things like that really don't start out looking very huge and something heroic, it'll eventually turn into a lot of times lifetime commitments. I think that art in the Junior Duck Stamp program and the Federal Duck Stamp program can connect other people outside of those programs and encourage them to get involved, and that may lead to further wanting to know about the habitat or the species and that could really lead down to conservation.
Young people are the future for wildlife and conservation. We need them to be educated, to understand, but more importantly, to be connected with their nature. It is their nature, it's our nature, and it makes us feel whole. And it's our job to get those young people engaged and involved so that they can feel this beauty that we feel as they go through their life.
Ding left us with a fantastic legacy that is protecting the environment on so many levels. But it's really up to us to carry on his work and not lose that legacy.
Darling was not a biologist. He was not a scientist. He was not a traditional environmental scientist. Instead, he was an artist. And you can protect nature oftentimes more effectively through literature, through art, through cartoons. And people should realize there's a humanistic aspect to the conservation movement that should also entice them.
I think that Ding Darling really was a Renaissance man. And this is why I say that. He didn't just stay with the profession that he could have made millions of dollars. He branched out. He wanted to have a voice that was going to be crossing over and having an effect in various areas. But he also wanted to affect public policy.
When people think about conservation, they may think in terms of a pendulum swinging one way or another to extreme. And the reality is that we have a limited number of resources. And I think Ding Darling called it betting on the jockey and not the horse, that if you don't pay attention to the natural resources that you're using up and not finding a way to sustain those resources, that you're going to find yourself in a position where your very capital of your investment is gone. And I think that's the message of conservation. You have to be conservative in the use of these gifts that have been given to us in this planet and make certain that it's sustainable for future generations. Our wealth is based on natural resources, and if we aren't conservative about them, our wealth will vanish.
I think if Darling were to look at the environment today, there's one thing he'd be thrilled about and one thing he'd be very disappointed about. He'd be thrilled by the Endangered Species Act, because since that was passed in 1973, we've had very, very few species go extinct. And extinction was a key theme of many of his cartoons, worried about extinction. I think he'd be very disappointed at the continual destruction of natural habitat. Our suburbanization, our human paving over many natural prairies, grasslands, wetlands, and so on would disappoint him. He thought that was the key issue for the conservation movement, protecting habitat, and we haven't done a good job since Darling passed on doing that.
Darling simply never rested on his laurels. One time when he was receiving a rather prestigious award, he was quoted as saying, "Giving awards to conservationists is like giving medals to generals that only lose wars." When Darling was successful in completing some goal of his, it was forgotten, it was in the past, now on to the next thing.
Ding Darling lived an inspiring life with so many visions and so many accomplishments. This is the plate for Ding's last published cartoon. It's called Bye Now, It's Been Wonderful Knowing You. It came out in 1962 when Ding passed away. The cartoon shows his office at the Des Moines Register. It contains so many of his favorite things. You can spend quite a bit of time looking and discovering the many facets of Ding, along with the things that meant so much to him.
Ding Darling saw things long before others did. For example, in 1949, he did a cartoon showing the world in an energy crisis. So he saw what was ahead for wildlife. He saw what was ahead for humanity, and he was passionate about giving voice to those insights that he had. And there are people in life who can see further ahead than others, and those are leaders.
What makes people follow is their belief in the leader. And Ding Darling was able to instill energy and excitement and an absolute passion to get the job done in everyone he was around. And I believe that's why Ding Darling was so influential across this great land.
Ding Darling was a successful man and an influential man because he found a way to do what he wanted to accomplish. He never got turned away. He would go left, he'd go right, he'd go over.
If you asked Darling what his most successful accomplishment was, what his greatest accomplishment was, I think that he would tell you it was a nonsense question. He just didn't believe there was any end to the things that needed to be done. It's just remarkable how many contributions this guy made, and hopefully he will be an inspiration to the younger generations coming on, because you can, as Darling believed, you can accomplish anything you want as long as you're willing to work hard at it and keep at it.
I'd like to thank you for letting me share Ding's story with you. And oh yes, thanks Grandpa Kip for sharing the memories. But before I go, let me ask you, where do we go from here? What do we need to do? Who do we need to become?
The restoration of at least a little of the natural environment destroyed by man's unwise management will, I believe, stand forever and set an example for future generations.
Ding Darling is an American individualist. He doesn't belong to any society ultimately. He just marched to the beat of his own drum.
I feel Ding Darling singing a lot of American songs, a lot of Americans who've gone out into nature, who've gone out into the woods hunting, who've sat out in the woods, who've gone out and felt the great peace and beauty of being outside. They know that what he's saying is true.
Somehow we've forgotten that we're all Americans. We need to come back to that notion. And I think it's coming back to the idea that America is great when America works together. And we fail when we divide and when we splinter.
It's about the song America the Beautiful. It's about protecting our great land. It's not a right-left thing. It's about being a good custodian of the land. In truth, conservation should be a true conservative's MO. You know, that we want to keep heritage and keep things that our children can experience.
When people ask me the most important thing they can do, I say raise a good child, a thoughtful child, a smart child, a kind child. And when you do that, you create citizens for future generations.